A 1912 wedding photo looks peaceful at first glance. A formal portrait of a bride and groom surrounded by their wedding party on church steps. But zoom in on the bride's hand, and you'll see something that turns this seemingly innocent photograph into evidence of a crime. Dark marks circle her wrist like shadows, bruises that tell a story of violence hidden behind the elaborate lace of her wedding gown. For 112 years, this photograph sat in archives, its terrible secret invisible to casual observers, until one curator looked closer and uncovered a tragedy that would expose the dark reality of domestic violence in America's Gilded Age and reveal how little has truly changed. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your location and what time you're watching. This helps YouTube recommend stories like this to others who need to understand that some photographs reveal far more than their subjects ever intended. In April 2024, Emily Harrison, a curator at the Philadelphia Museum of History, was cataloging a recently acquired collection of early 20th century photographs. Among hundreds of standard images documenting life in Philadelphia between 1900 and 1930, one wedding picture from 1912 immediately captured her attention. Something about it felt wrong, though she couldn't initially articulate what disturbed her professional instincts. This is the story of what that photograph revealed and the young woman whose suffering was captured forever in a single moment, frozen in time like a scream that no one heard for over a century. The image showed a formal wedding party posed on stone steps in front of what appeared to be a church. The bride and groom stood in the center, surrounded by bridesmaids in pale dresses and groomsmen in dark suits. Everything about the composition seemed entirely typical for the period. The formal poses, the elaborate Victorian Gothic architecture in the background, the careful arrangement of the wedding party in descending rows. But something nagged at Emily's instincts, a subtle wrongness that made her set the photograph aside for closer examination. She brought the photograph to her workstation and placed it under a magnifying glass, scanning the faces of the wedding party. The groom appeared to be in his early 30s with a thick mustache and the confident bearing typical of successful young men of that era. The bridesmaids smiled appropriately, their expressions showing the reserved happiness expected at formal occasions. The groomsmen maintained the serious, dignified demeanor that photography conventions of the time demanded, but the bride's face was different. Emily leaned closer, studying the young woman's expression with growing concern. Her smile was fixed, almost rigid, and didn't reach her eyes. There was something in those eyes, a flatness, a distance, perhaps even fear, that seemed jarring in what should have been a joyful moment. The bride's posture was stiff, her shoulders held in a way that suggested tension rather than the relaxed happiness of a woman on her wedding day. Then Emily noticed the hands. The groom's hand rested possessively on the bride's waist, clearly visible in the photograph. But the bride's hands were positioned strangely, one clutching a large bouquet of flowers so tightly that Emily could see the tension even in the old photograph. And the other hand. Emily adjusted the magnifying glass, bringing the image into sharper focus. The bride's left hand hung at her side, partially hidden by the folds of her elaborate wedding dress, but enough was visible to see something deeply disturbing. The hand was positioned at an unnatural angle, and even through the limitations of 1912 photography, Emily could see what appeared to be significant bruising around the wrist, dark marks that the long lace sleeves of the wedding gown couldn't quite conceal. Emily's heart rate increased as she transferred the photograph to the museum's sophisticated digital scanning equipment, capable of capturing extraordinary detail from historical images and revealing information invisible to the unaided eye. When the high-resolution image appeared on her computer screen, she enlarged it to focus specifically on the bride's visible left hand. At this magnification level, the details were undeniable and profoundly disturbing. The bruising around her wrist was extensive, dark, finger-shaped marks that formed a clear pattern consistent with someone having grabbed her forcefully, violently. The bruising appeared relatively fresh, perhaps only days old when the photograph was taken, the discoloration still dark and pronounced. Emily shifted her focus to other parts of the image. examining every visible inch of the bride's body for additional signs of trauma. The high neckline of the wedding dress made it impossible to see her throat or upper chest. But Emily noticed other troubling details. The bride's right hand, the one clutching the bouquet, showed similar though less pronounced bruising on the fingers, as if she had tried to defend herself. There were also faint marks visible along her collarbone, where the lace of her dress became semi-transparent in the photograph. More bruising, carefully concealed but not quite hidden. Emily zoomed in on the bride's face, studying her expression with the enhanced clarity the digital scan provided. What she had initially perceived as a fixed smile now revealed itself as something more complex and heartbreaking. The young woman's jaw was clenched with visible tension. Her eyes, though looking directly at the camera as convention required, showed a haunting emptiness. Not the nervousness of a young bride or the solemn formality of Victorian photography, but something that looked disturbingly like resignation or even despair. The groom's hand on her waist, Emily now noticed, wasn't resting there gently. His fingers pressed into her side with enough force to create visible indentations in the fabric of her dress. His own expression, which Emily had initially read as confidence, now seemed more like possessiveness or control. There was something in his eyes, a hardness, a coldness that made Emily instinctively uncomfortable, even across the distance of 112 years. She turned her attention to the other people in the photograph, wondering if anyone else showed signs of noticing or reacting to what was clearly a troubling situation. The 4 bridesmaids showed varying reactions. 2 of them, positioned farthest from the bride, smiled pleasantly, apparently unaware of anything amiss. But the 2 bridesmaids standing immediately adjacent to the bride told a different story entirely. The woman to the bride's immediate left, who appeared to be roughly the same age, had an expression Emily recognized from years studying historical photographs. The carefully neutral face of someone trying desperately not to reveal their true emotions. Her smile was forced, her eyes troubled. Most tellingly, she was positioned slightly away from the bride, as if maintaining physical distance. This bridesmaid's hand, visible at her side, was clenched into a tight fist. The bridesmaid on the other side showed similar signs of discomfort. Her gaze wasn't directed at the camera, but rather at the groom. And even through the grainy quality of early photography, Emily could detect what looked like obvious disapproval or even disgust in her expression. Behind the main wedding party, partially visible in the background, stood what appeared to be family members and guests. Emily enlarged this section. An elderly woman, dressed in the heavy black clothing typical of widows of that era, stood near the church entrance with an expression of profound sadness. Her hand was raised to her face in a gesture that suggested she might have been weeping or was deeply distressed. If you're still watching, you're braver than most. Tell us in the comments. If you had been at this wedding in 1912, would you have had the courage to speak up? Or would social pressure have kept you silent too? Emily knew that identifying the people in the photograph would be crucial to understanding the story behind those terrible bruises and that haunted expression. She began with the most obvious identifying feature, the church itself. The Victorian Gothic architecture visible in the background was distinctive, with elaborate stone carvings around the entrance, a specific style of pointed arch windows, and what appeared to be a cornerstone with carved text. She spent several hours researching churches in Philadelphia that had been standing in 1912 and matched the architectural style. The combination of specific elements eventually led her to St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Center City, a prominent congregation that had served Philadelphia's wealthy elite since the 1850s. She contacted the church directly, and 2 days later sat in a small office in the church basement, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers containing records of every wedding, baptism, and funeral conducted at St. Mark's since its founding. On a page dated May 18, 1912, she found an entry that made her pulse quicken. Marriage solemnized between Mr. Robert Harrison, age 32 of Philadelphia, and Miss Clara Bennett, age 19 of Philadelphia. Ceremony performed by Reverend Thomas Whitfield, 19 years old. The bride's young age was consistent with her appearance in the image. Emily immediately began researching the Harrison and Bennett families using Philadelphia's extensive genealogical databases and digitized newspaper archives. What she discovered over the next several days painted a troubling picture of wealth, social pressure, and violence hidden behind the facade of respectable society. Robert Harrison came from one of Philadelphia's most prominent families. His father, Jonathan Harrison, had made an enormous fortune in steel manufacturing during the industrial boom, expanding into railroads and real estate. By 1912, the Harrisons were among the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania, with a mansion on Rittenhouse Square and extensive social connections. Robert had been groomed from birth to take over the family business empire. Newspaper society pages described him as a commanding presence in Philadelphia business circles and a most eligible bachelor before his marriage. But Emily also found darker hints in the historical record. A brief 1909 article mentioned Robert Harrison being involved in an altercation at his gentleman's club that resulted in another member requiring medical attention, though charges were never filed. Another article from 1911 mentioned a lawsuit filed by a former household servant alleging cruel treatment, though the case had been settled out of court. Clara Bennett's background was quite different. Her father was a bank clerk, a position that provided middle-class comfort, but nothing approaching the Harrison family's wealth. According to society pages, Clara had been noted for her beauty and gentle disposition during her debut into Philadelphia society at age 17. The engagement between Robert Harrison and Clara Bennett had been announced in February 1912, just 3 months before the wedding. The newspaper announced it as the most favorable match. Reading between the lines, Emily suspected this had been an arranged marriage, the Bennetts gaining social elevation through connection to the wealthy Harrisons, and the Harrisons gaining a young, beautiful, socially appropriate bride for their heir. Emily continued her research, moving through newspaper archives month by month after the May 1912 wedding. For the first several months, she found only expected society page mentions, standard documentation of wealthy society life with no hint of what might be happening behind closed doors. But in November 1912, just 6 months after the wedding, Emily found something that made her breath catch. A brief article buried on page 7 of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Mrs. Clara Harrison, wife of prominent businessman Robert Harrison, was treated at Pennsylvania Hospital yesterday afternoon for injuries sustained in what family representatives described as an unfortunate accident in the home. Mrs. Harrison reportedly fell down a staircase at the Harrison residence. She was released after treatment and has returned home to recover a fall down the stairs. Emily had studied enough historical cases of domestic violence to recognize this as one of the most common explanations used to explain away injuries inflicted by abusive husbands. She searched for additional mentions of Clara Harrison over the following months and years. What emerged was a heartbreaking pattern. March 1913, another brief mention of Clara being treated for a sprained wrist sustained while gardening. August 1913, a notice that Mrs. Harrison had retired to the family's country estate for nervous exhaustion, a Victorian euphemism for what might have been depression or trauma society. Page mentions of Clara appearing at events became less frequent after the first year of marriage. When she was mentioned, descriptions sometimes included odd details. Mrs. Harrison wore an elegant high-necked gown in summer when such clothing would have been uncomfortably warm, perhaps hiding bruises on her throat. In January 1914, Emily found an article that made her hands tremble. Philadelphia Society mourns young Mrs. Harrison Clara Bennett Harrison, beloved wife of Robert Harrison, passed away on January 15, 1914, at the family residence. She was 21 years old. The cause of death was reported as pneumonia following a prolonged illness. I am 21 years old, dead less than 2 years after that wedding photograph was taken. Less than 2 years later, she stood on those church steps with bruises on her wrists and terror in her eyes. Emily obtained Clara Harrison's death certificate, which listed the cause of death as pneumonia with complications and general debility and weakened constitution. But what had caused this weakened constitution in a woman who should have been in the prime of health? She reached out to Dr. James Mitchell, a colleague who specialized in historical medical practices and had access to archived hospital records. A week later, Dr. Mitchell called with disturbing news. He had found admission records from Pennsylvania Hospital for 3 separate visits by Clara Harrison, far more than the single newspaper mention had suggested. First admission, November 1912. Patient presented with contusions to the face and torso, fractured rib on the left side, and significant bruising to the arms. The examining physician, Dr. Robert Sterling, noted in private observations that the pattern of injuries was inconsistent with a simple fall and more suggestive of assault. Second admission, March 1913. Patient presented with a severely sprained wrist, extensive bruising to the forearm, and what the physician described as defensive wounds on the hands, consistent with attempting to ward off blows. Third admission, September 1913. Patient presented unconscious. Examination revealed a concussion, significant bruising to the throat consistent with strangulation, and evidence of broken blood vessels in the eyes. But Dr. Mitchell had even more devastating information. The hospital archives contained Dr. Sterling's personal journal from that period, and he had written extensively about Clara Harrison's case. Emily read the scanned journal entries, struggling through the physician's handwriting. November 20th, 1912. Treated Mrs. Clara Harrison today for injuries she claims resulted from a fall downstairs. I do not believe this explanation. The injuries show a pattern consistent with violent assault. When I attempted to question her privately, she became visibly frightened. Her husband is a man of considerable wealth and influence. I'm ashamed to admit that I allowed myself to be intimidated. I have failed this young woman. March 15, 1913. Mrs. Harrison returned to the hospital today. Once again, injuries inconsistent with her explanation. The husband stands over her like a guard, controlling every word she speaks. I can see the fear in her eyes, the desperate plea for help that she cannot voice. What can I do? September 8th, 1913. Today, I genuinely feared for Mrs. Harrison's life. The injuries were severe, evidence of strangulation. If her husband continues this pattern, he will eventually kill her. I attempted to speak with her mother, suggesting that Mrs. Harrison might benefit from staying with her family. Mrs. Bennett looked at me with such sadness and said only, "You don't understand how these things work in families like theirs. There is nothing we can do." Dr. Sterling's journal continued through Clara's final months, January 3rd, 1914. I was called to the Harrison residence to attend to Mrs. Harrison, who has developed a respiratory infection. The young woman is severely underweight, clearly malnourished, despite living in a household of extraordinary wealth. The pneumonia is serious, but I'm more concerned about her overall weakened state. She seems to have lost the will to fight, to recover, perhaps even to live. January 16th, 1914. Clara Harrison died yesterday. Dr. Whitmore listed the cause as pneumonia with complications. This may be medically accurate in the narrowest sense, but it obscures the deeper truth. Clara Harrison was killed by her husband as surely as if he had struck the final blow himself. 2 years of violence destroyed her spirit, weakened her body, and left her unable to fight off an infection that a healthy young woman should have survived. Robert Harrison has committed murder and will face no consequences. Emily sat back from her computer, tears running down her face as she absorbed the full tragedy. Clara Harrison's story needed to be told. The wedding photograph, with its terrible hidden evidence, needed to be understood not as a curious historical artifact, but as documentation of a young woman's suffering. She spent the next month compiling all her research. The wedding photograph with detailed analysis of the visible injuries, the newspaper articles documenting Clara's accidents, the hospital records showing the pattern of violence, Dr. Sterling's journal entries revealing what physicians knew but felt powerless to address, and the death certificate that obscured the true cause of Clara's death. In June 2024, the Philadelphia Museum of History opened a major exhibition titled Silent Suffering: Domestic Violence in Gilded Age Philadelphia. The centerpiece was the wedding photograph, displayed with detailed annotations pointing out the bruises on Clara's wrists, the tension in her posture, the fear in her eyes. All the things that had been invisible to casual viewers, but which told a powerful story once you knew what to look for. The exhibition included Clara's full story, presented with compassion and historical context about the legal and social conditions that left women trapped in abusive marriages during that era. It explained that married women in 1912 had limited legal rights, divorce was extremely difficult to obtain and carried enormous social stigma. Domestic violence was considered a private family matter rather than a crime. Women from wealthy families often faced even more barriers to escape, because maintaining the family's reputation took precedence over individual safety. The exhibition drew enormous crowds and extensive media coverage. National news outlets picked up the story. Domestic violence organizations used Clara's story in their educational materials, pointing out that the dynamics of abuse, the isolation, the control, the escalating violence, the victim's inability to escape, remain remarkably similar across the century that has passed since Clara's death. Emily was contacted by Rebecca Harrison Chen, who identified herself as a descendant of Robert Harrison's brother. Family stories passed down through generations always portrayed Robert as a difficult, violent man. My great-grandfather apparently tried to intervene on Clara's behalf at least once, but was told to mind his own business. Thank you for telling Clara's story truthfully. Domestic violence advocates pointed out the continuing relevance. The dynamics we see in this 1912 case still exist today, wrote Maria Torres, director of a Philadelphia area shelter. Clara's story reminds us that this is not a new problem, and that we must continue working to ensure that women today have the protections and resources to escape that Clara Harrison never had. Standing before the exhibition on its opening day, Emily looked at Clara's face in that wedding photograph, the young woman's eyes showing fear and resignation on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. The bruises on her wrists, once invisible, now told their story clearly to thousands of visitors. Clara Bennett Harrison, dead at 21, finally had her truth acknowledged. The photograph her abuser had commissioned to document his possession of a beautiful young bride had become instead a testament to her suffering and a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle against domestic violence. After 112 years of silence, Clara's story was finally being heard. This story reminds us that photographs can be evidence, that history often hides the suffering of those who had no voice, and that looking closer, really seeing, can reveal truths that have been hidden for over a century. Clara couldn't escape her abuser in 1912, but her story can help us ensure that women today have the resources, support, and legal protections that she was denied. If you've watched until the end, you understand why some stories must be told, no matter how much time has passed. Tell us in the comments, what do you think can be done to prevent tragedies like Clara's today? How can we better recognize the signs of abuse and support victims? Share this story, remember Clara, and never look away from the truth, even when it's hidden in plain sight. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware. Some photographs reveal more than their subjects ever intended, and sometimes that's exactly what the world needs to see.